Uh, I'm dialing in from Lenape-Hoking, the lands of the Lenape Nations, otherwise known as New York City. I just want to introduce myself alongside Steph and my colleagues here. This seminar is part of the Indigenous Data Exchange. And for those of you who don't know me, I am the founder of Local Context, which is a 501c3 that delivers particular data tools for Indigenous communities, and also more recently, the founder of the Indigenous Data Law Lab here at New York University, where we support communities around agreements and legal questions around data and data sovereignty. Um, I was put in contact with ZAM maybe about a year ago through a Microsoft invitation to Local Context to have a conversation about Indigenous data sovereignty. Those conversations kind of didn't go as far as we thought that they might do, but it was certainly, given all the kind of questions that were coming to me from different kinds of communities around AI and Indigenous languages, AI and Indigenous curriculum, different kinds of companies that were looking to Indigenous tribal nations around infrastructure data, that really kind of knew that we needed to have a conversation about AI and Indigenous interests in a different kind of way. So we wanted to invite ZAM to come and share their experience in relationship to both working in Microsoft and the different kinds of ways in which AI and Indigenous issues intersect. And our effort really here is to provide information. It's not to polarize on these issues, but really to provide information and inform, particularly because we are really concerned about free, prior, and informed consent in relationship to AI and Indigenous interests. And so thinking through how we can bring more information into our larger community around this was kind of what the impetus was to hold this webinar. And there will be others that kind of follow from this as well. So with that, I do want to introduce you to Zam DeShields, who is going to take the bulk of the webinar today, and who we will have a conversation with at the end of the webinar, Steph and I as well. So Zam is a member of the Chickasaw Nation and has previously served as a planning director for both Samish Indian Nation and Swinomish Indian tribal community, where they developed expertise in tribal governance and policy frameworks. Then, as a contractor, they established Microsoft's Indigenous Program Office, working with Indigenous communities globally to develop AI, machine translation tools, and replicable processes for low resource languages. So with that, Zam, I'm going to hand it over to you, and really excited to have so many of you on this call. I don't think we've had 450 registrants for our webinars before, so thrilled that you could all join us today. We do have a questionnaire that we're going to put in the chat at some point during the webinar as well, so please take a moment to fill that out. And I am going to just open the slides first, so let me just do that. Okay, not doing that like that.
So while Jane gets that going, okay, we've got it pulled up. I just want to say thank you guys for joining us today. For whoever is here just because they're curious, or maybe it's directly relevant to the work that you're doing. I think that a lot of this content has to do with really every person who listens to what's going on with AI today. We've got real risks, benefits, and lots of complexity. There's nothing that you could boil down into a simple phrase or say like this is the end all be all. But that's what we're going to navigate a little bit today. So next slide, if you could. So a little bit
And
on,
sorry,
okay,
Zam,
let's,
before you jump in, I just had this slide in here, which is just an advertisement for our next webinar on the IEEE recommended practice and the provenance of Indigenous data. And that will be at the end. So I'll put it up again, but over to you again.
yeah. So Chickasaw, Saya. I am Chickasaw. Chocma, hello. I'm sitting in Coast Salish territory today. Chickasaw is from Missouri region in the United States, and most recently seated in Oklahoma. So I have a background in urban and regional planning. Went to Eastern. They have a pretty robust tribal planning track, and I spent some time while I was there working with tribes on census data and improving the collection and overall inputs for US Census data, and then helping tribes use that data to do different things that they needed to do. A lot of it was tied to funding. I worked a few different roles and then ended up at Samish Indian Nation out on the coast in Washington, and then Swinomish Indian tribal community. And in my time there, encountered lots of different views on data protection, data privacy, best ways to implement things, and spent a ton of time writing policy and law. Um, as many of you know, if you work in Indian country, you tend to have a whole stack of jobs, and usually you get more handed to you as time goes on. And that definitely was true in my time at both Samish and Swinomish. Um, when I moved on and started at Microsoft, I helped them launch their global Indigenous program office. It had a focus in US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand as the like initial areas to target. And one of the largest projects that I worked on during my time there, which is just launched of a couple of weeks ago, was a Indigenous language pipeline to help. I mean, I will say this. This is how Microsoft couched it. To help low resource languages get into machine translation or LLM based language translation. It was very interesting. Worked with a lot of different groups of people. Worked on licensing agreements. And the thing that kept coming back is the big concerns around data controls. First off, if they're going to hand over their data to Microsoft, what's going to happen to it? Do they get to control it? How are they going to make sure that these language models stay up to date and don't just move on to an AI controlling them or Microsoft having all of the controls? So, who owns the data? Who will it be used for? And how can these communities control it once it's started? And those questions never were fully resolved during my time at Microsoft. Ultimately, the project did launch, and there is an open uh, potential for people to use Microsoft products or their model to get into LLM work with language translation. But there's some big questions around data privacy and that. So after my time at Microsoft ended, which was just this past August, I was a contractor. So they basically were able to hide me through a lot of the cuts because I was a contractor. That's how it works in tech. And I was able to continue my work through the entirety of the maximum amount of time I was able to be there, which was a year and a half. And then after that, I turned and started working on my own things. So next slide. I just want to give you a background on how I got into this. I started off as a wary user. I was like, this is not that great. I was using LLMs just kind of casually. This was before I was working for Microsoft. At the time, I had a partner who was at Meta, way up there in Gen AI, and it meant that I got kind of this insider view of what they were doing, fun things, reckless, very reckless things, making decisions incredibly fast, and just trying to keep that clipping along. So I was watching this from an outside view, just wary of it. When I started with Microsoft, initially I began using Copilot, and it was like magic. They had not put up safeguards and guardrails in internally at Microsoft. So as a contractor, I could search all of the documents for the entire organization unless they had been locked down specifically. I could see authors, I could see multiple versions. And for someone who had to navigate as a contractor, typically you go into these tech companies and you have no idea how the whole org structure works. you might get an org chart. But this allowed me to figure out who to talk to in almost every instance as I was navigating the organization. It was amazing, magic, as I said. Then guardrails popped up. That was sometime about 6 months in, and they locked down my ability to search everyone's documents to just my own. And man, that was a lot less helpful. But I was able to use my supervisor to do those searches, and then their ability to search things was also locked down. So it was interesting to be using AI before they really figured out how to uh, put up those guardrails, at least in that internal system there. So my views on that changed a bit. So next slide. The later phases. So Copilot became ineffective, and then I started using LLMs on my own time, and figuring out how to get them to do what I needed to do. So a lot of prompting, understanding, and just doing a number of things that were all over the place, just based off of my own interests. So there was the work piece and learning it from a corporate perspective, from Microsoft's views as they had them, and doing that in my day job to doing things on my own personal interest. So in that time, I started building an internal family systems therapy framework. Absolutely bonkers to be doing that without a therapist. My therapist at the time was happy to join me. But I learned how to set up RAG. What is the AI actually doing? But then by the midsummer of 2025, I had gone, in a deep dive. I had done a ton of coding, setting up this full framework. And then there was this point in the summer last year where it became very clear that these US based corporations were just essentially ignoring whatever privacy commitments they had made and pulling everything. So I had already like put all of my stuff out there. If you're doing any sort of augmented work with an AI, then you're just dumping your things like right into the corporate data swirl that's happening right now. So I was very nervous at the point where it became abundantly clear that there was nothing safe about OpenAI and what they were doing. I looked into the other companies, and it was clear that it was across the board. There's no like safe option that was US based. So I switched to rebuilding the model just outside of AI and allowing whoever the user would be in future to select the model and then still be able to run the program, if you will. But it wasn't that much longer, like maybe a month before I went to a full stop and was just like, I have to stop doing this. There's no option that is going to work with web-based models. So at that point, I pivoted to trying to understand what are the ways that someone could use the benefits of AI with reducing risk. And so offline, and it says community-based systems. I have learned and understood how to set those up and implement those at this time, but um, most of what I've done has been teaching people how to set these offline AI models up on their own systems or completely disconnect them from the internet and be able to use like pocket versions of AI. So next slide. This is the part that I think is most critical for those who are in Indigenous areas. With the background that I have working for Indigenous governments, being Indigenous, and then going into this corporate experience of intersection with Indigenous communities, um, the level of understanding for Indigenous communities and the sovereignty and self-determination components of their existence is not well understood. There were some people at Microsoft who did get it, and there is actually like a full sales team that works on cloud-based systems that are just for Indigenous communities. That said, it's not necessarily that I'm saying, great, Microsoft has a great product for this, go get it from them. That isn't what I'm saying at all. I'm saying There's some understanding there. I found that there was a lot of educating that I had to do when I was in that role. Uh, Indigenous communities are inherently sovereign. Um, there is no amount of recognition from a government or otherwise that grants that to Indigenous communities. It's there already. Um, Sometimes the recognition is really helpful, but here in the US, we still have a number of Indigenous communities that have not gained recognition or have lost recognition by our federal government here in the United States. So, self-determination is the right we have to govern ourselves, our lands, our resources, and continue with our culture. We, I think that a lot of people have heard about what's going on with AI and how it has left behind a number of communities. Indigenous communities are very much a part of that. It's not a new story; it's an old story. Um, there is I would say that this conversation has come up with each iteration of technology and with each iteration of even government structure. So, what we do now with AI is similar to how we have approached, what people did with cloud-based systems. And what I'm here to tell you today is that the best analogy that I've come up with is that it's like abstinence only education. You can't opt out of AI. AI is here, it's surrounding us, and it's using the data that is already out there. And if Indigenous communities are not preparing for it, accommodating it, making decisions on it specifically, it doesn't mean that those risks go away. Next slide. So, on Indigenous data sovereignty, putting this in a more specific lens, it extends governance to data about our people, our lands, our institutions. Indigenous communities are collecting probably higher levels of data than most governments as far as like what they collect and track over a period of time. It's very rich. It's very important that those tribes get to keep it, choose how it's used. That is, one of the main functions of the work that local context is doing. And it's also something that I think when we think about the data that's collected, there's two components of it with AI. First off, as many people know, a lot of data was not included. The baseline data for LLM building excluded minority communities, disability communities, indigenous communities, and that means that those models, those LLMs, are already acting outside of an understanding of the cultures that we exist in. So what we choose to do with the data moving forward, it can't really influence the baseline models of the LLMs that exist, but you can choose who has access to that knowledge, who's collecting it moving forward. Where it lives is very critical, and then making some decisions on what it can be used for. In many cases in the past, historically, data has been used to harm people groups. And I think the same can be true for Indigenous communities. And I would say also for individuals. Like I already told you about the mistakes that I made early on with AI. And I'm not alone in that. But the fact that these mega corporations essentially have whatever I typed into those AI models is a detriment to me. And so that individual data safety and privacy is also an important component. So that's where it's like this is a universal application. It doesn't just have to do with indigenous governments. Next slide. Okay, so as I said before, you can't opt out. There is some people who have taken an approach of like, I'm not going to use AI, like whatever reason they cite, whether that's environmental components or not feeding more money into these corporations and more data. Those are definitely valid concerns and attempts to combat what's happening, but they're not necessarily effective. So I would say that participation isn't optional. It's something that's happening in local governments, state governments, federal governments, and in Indian country. If people are not spending the time to train their staff and set policy and then actually enforce it, then use of AI is still likely happening amongst staff in a government type setting. And that's frankly, it's risky, and you can't just say no, don't do it. But we do need to actually take a look at what are you doing around this policy? How are you engaging with AI? And what guidance are you looking for? Next slide. Okay, so there is a thinking frame that I'm going to set up for the rest of this presentation. But first, I'm going to just talk about three realities. Data extraction is already happening globally without consent. That is across the board. Large models have been trained on massive scraped data sets. And anything that's public, I think that at this point you can expect that if it hasn't been used, it is at risk of that. And consent is not really a part of that discussion. Um, so participation isn't optional. It's happening in most settings that you're encountering. Um, Even if you personally have never used AI, data about you, your community, and your language is already being copied, embedded, and then used again in these different models that are happening. The real question is how you engage and under what governance. We can't stop AI from existing, but we can fight for who controls it, where it runs, and what rules govern its use. So, on to the real problems. This is where I want to get things down to a closer uh, tie into reality. There's a lot of distractions out there. And the real problems are ones that are important to focus on and not hopefully get too distracted by the ones that are maybe real problems, but not about AI, or seem like real problems, but actually are not. So the data extraction piece without consent or compensation, that's a real problem. Surveillance and tracking of communities, that's a real problem. We've got loss of control over cultural knowledge and language. Absolutely, that is a component. And then exclusion from governance decisions about AI systems. Where you sit in the world can have a big impact on what's happening with AI. And unfortunately, in the US, we are dealing with a government that is largely not regulating AI. And I would say that even outside of the US, the controls are weak at best or too late. There's a number of different things that are issues around the governance of AI systems. Next slide. Okay, so distractions. There are so many headlines attempting to capture our attention right now. There is a huge amount of things that are coming up in media that are more distractions from AI than like here is something that you can actually do about it. So the AI will save us narratives that ignore current harms. There's focus on individual users, like your specific use of AI can impact the environmental components, or the way that you use AI can change the amount of harm that you personally experience. I would say that there is harm happening kind of across the board, and there is a greater need for systemic power on this rather than individuals making choices. It's very akin to the narrative that has been pushed on environmentalism, it being like personal responsibility rather than a systemic issue that we need to solve. Next slide. Okay, so thought traps. Nothing can be done. Throwing your hands up and being like, gosh, we already are too late. There's nothing we can do. That prevents you from taking action. There are absolutely things that we can do to guide how things move forward. AI is neutral. No, it ignores who built it and for what purpose. We do know that there is a peek behind the curtain here as far as how non-neutral AI is. There's a number of scary things that are happening that AI is capable of now, like blackmailing people and exploitation, etc. Um, there is a specific website which I'm going to see if one of our co-hosts can throw up on here. It's the AI Problems Index, and that references what we've got for studies out there. And I think that basing this in as much factual information as possible is the best option today, as far as like trying to get a real understanding of what's happening. And I'm using the framework of this particular index to guide what I'm talking about today. So it is organized in the same fashion. We just need better prompts. That's treating a symptom. It's not a cause. Yes, you can prompt better, but that doesn't mean that things will be better. And also, if we don't use it, we'll be left behind. I would say that that narrative came up in my discussions with Indigenous communities in my Microsoft role. There were a number of people who felt that if they didn't work hard to get their language into an LLM format, then their language and culture would be left behind. And I would say, to some degree, that may be true. But there are also those data controls concerns. Next slide. Okay, so safer practices now. This goes back into my abstinence only education. We're talking about safer practices with AI because there is no safe. And we also know that abstinence or opting out is actually a false choice. That's not a thing we can do. So how can we do things safer now moving forward? Um, when you are going to work with a vendor, and whether that's on an individual basis, I'm going to go and choose an AI model to work on or work a particular issue through, um, learning where the data lives and who can access it. So anybody who you're going to go and work with, that is a solid question to be asking them. Then map where your organization's data currently sits. Some communities I encountered when I was working in my Microsoft role had all of their community's data in Google Drive. That's a cloud-based system. Um, it was a funny thing to have be working on the Microsoft side and encounter these Google pieces. But I would say that where your data lives is super important. This is kind of an important thing at least in the US. It's probably also true globally. One of the things that Microsoft did have a decent handle on is when they were going and selling cloud-based products to tribes, they had a specific cloud that was for Indigenous that would basically guarantee that all of the data would be hosted within the US, which helps maintain tribal sovereignty over that data. So it allows them to keep controls over that. That said, there is still risks with that. As we know, a lot of these corporations will still allow federal overreach into data that's stored in the US. So there is like a lot of different components there that have to be looked into. There are some tribes that are building their own data centers. It's kind of worth looking into those as an option. Um, Slow down before you're uploading sensitive information. This is like 101 thing, but like that is good for any person who's using AI. And then as far as policy creation within the tribal setting, uh, it is incredibly risky. If you do not set policy for your staff, uh, the big risk is that sensitive information going into a public AI. It's not something that you can pull back, and once it's out there, it's out there. There were instances in Australia where social workers were uploading like full case files, and people who were in completely different chats in other parts of the country were able to pull the information from those private files from a private chat from another person. And it basically just the data privacy issues are humongous. They don't have a good grasp on how to actually keep those pinned down, or maybe they don't care. I don't know. But whatever the case, policy training, both of those things are incredibly important. This isn't just like the new Google. This is very different and riskier. So as I said, create AI policies and provide regular training. Okay, next slide. All right, so again, we're going on in a safer direction. This is not the silver bullet solution. There isn't one. But there is the option for communities and individuals to create their own offline or community-based model. Uh, just like setting up on-premises data storage and like locally accessed, the words are escaping me right now, but a lot of tribes create like a local storage system for all of their files and things like that electronically. You can essentially download AI models and run them locally. You can set them up so that they're RAG systems, so that they're searching community documents locally. One of the great things about using smaller models or setting up a RAG system, and that's uh, essentially you're giving like a specific data set for a big LLM to go and query, and you're kind of giving them a boundaried space to go and look. Your The change in effectiveness for AI is humongous when you switch to using a RAG system or a smaller model that is working off of a specific data set. There is a lot of benefit to setting up something like this, even if it's just for your own personal use. Uh, but you'll find that when you're using an LLM, just like pulling up ChatGPT or Claude or whoever AI that you're using, if you're using one of the big general LLMs, the quality of the outputs can be very low. You can have a ton of hallucinations. You can see all things pull back where you're like, where did that even come from? I have no idea what this is referencing right now. Or they'll even have trouble having memory within the same conversation thread. When you start to use something that is a more specific AI model, um, like one that is offline and uses a RAG system to search community documents, the quality of the outputs raises so much that it is quite shocking. It actually seems useful. And maybe you find AI useful across the board. I've found that that the usefulness or like quality of outputs has wavered significantly over time. Like it's gone from being amazing to like, wow, this is trash. And just with each new model output, it's like all over the place on quality. Um, all right, so there is a question on RAG system. I will get into that a little bit at the end. I want to make sure that I'm pulling up proper definitions for people so that I'm not saying something that is completely off the wall. Um, So for tribal nations, a small on-premises model that you fully control beats a public cloud model that you don't, as far as like quality and safety. There is also another component to this, and we'll get into this a little bit later as well. But when you are doing things on premises, thank you, Lance. Wonderful. Um, when you are doing things on premises, your need for doing it properly and ensuring that you have uh, an actual IT oversight, ensuring that you are not vulnerable to data extraction, attacks from external. There's a lot of components there that really need to be thought through when these are set up. It's one of the reasons why I'm not saying, hey, I can do it for you, because I think doing this through somebody who knows what they're doing and can make sure that all of the safety components are set up is imperative when you are setting up something that is for on-premises. All right, next slide. Okay, so resources and monitoring. AI is changing constantly. Every day there's something different. There's a lot of things that you could go and read. I tend to reference the AI Problems Index as my go-to for making sure that I'm reading academic papers and journals, studies that are coming out. There's a few other resources that are pretty critical. Obviously, local contexts, the Indigenous Data Lab, and Data Sovereignty Network, and the Data Alliance. Going to official resources for information on AI, especially if they're keeping up to date with things, like you know, if things are out of date so fast that you do want to make sure that you're looking at resources that are relevant for literally the day you're looking at them. But I found that so far the AI Problems Index has been a very reliable source to go to for me to just get some grounding truths as far as what's happening in latest developments with AI without getting distracted by the headlines that are just clickbait fun. All right, next slide. So I think that is it for my component. So I think Jane is going to join me here and potentially others.
I am going to join you. And thank you so much, Zam, for just walking us through this, not just as something that you've read about in relationship to AI, but something that you've experienced and bringing that to this wider audience where we're really trying to think about how do we inform? We know so many people have questions and can have concerns legitimately. As well as kind of what are the possibilities around utilizing AI to actually serve Indigenous interests. I think you said one key thing that I think was really interesting, that AI is an infrastructure. And what happens when that infrastructure is built on extraction is really different in terms of turning it around to serve those communities that have had their data extracted from. And so, kind of, what does that mean? My background is in law, as you know, as now our audience knows, it's actually in intellectual property law. And so, what we've been seeing within this space is that law is in an epic catch-up game. It is kind of across the globe, we're seeing a range of decisions coming down that are actually often quite contradictory in relationship to each other. And so that creates different kinds of uncertainty in relationship to how tribal nations should act in relationship to protecting their data. So we have kinds of two main problems, right? One is the enormous amount of Indigenous data that is out there in the world already, much of it that Indigenous peoples themselves can't find or control because it's in museums or it's in archives or it's in universities or it's in biodiversity repositories. So we have kind of that legacy data problem. But we also have, this question that you raised as well as them, is like, how do we put in protections around data that's being generated now? And
Mm.
kind of what does that look like? And I mean, I would love to hear a little bit of your experience, because some of the things that I've been hearing is that even if you write into agreements and clauses that specifically address AI, that they're not necessarily being held into account, that they're not necessarily being recognized. And I'd love to hear, what you saw within Microsoft, even if it was a short period of time, around some of the legal transparency or lack of transparency, grappling with some of the data privacy issues.
Yeah, so it's interesting. The project that I worked on while I was at Microsoft, for the whole time I was there, was just launched, and I'm gonna see if I can pull up the link for that just for people's reference. But when I was working with Indigenous communities across the board, everyone was concerned about the data. Like, what are you gonna do with it? Are we gonna get it back? Do you have it forever? And are you gonna just like take this and run, and will this just get like fed into some giant LLM model? Those worries were never sunset while I was there. Um, there were a few data licensing agreements that were written that did actually have a sunset clause on the data use. They kept some indigenous communities' data on a separate blob storage. And I will say that Microsoft has the capability to keep things completely separate from the rest of the data that they hold. Um, that said, the free version means you're going to give them your data now. That's what this project has resulted in. And the paid option, which isn't really published or seen out there anywhere, you could pay Microsoft to do the work and keep it completely separate. It's incredibly costly. So there's, you know, a number of different ways that people could approach trying to do that now, but I will say this. I knew that Microsoft could address concerns. What resulted in the project was this other version of it, which is essentially like when you go and use their posting on GitHub, you are authorizing them to use whatever content you put in there. And so that gets swamped up. And that was true. I mean, Microsoft was looking for more data because more data means better LLMs. So that there's like a high incentive to get as much data as possible from people. I would say that Microsoft is a little more courteous than the average tech company when they approach this. Like, it is known that Google and Meta just stole, and like OpenAI as a parent company as well. Uh, Microsoft specifically did not take that approach, but I would say that there is a little bit of hiding the ball happening right now with the opportunity that they've put out there for having low resource languages get into an LLM format.
So that segues me nicely into another question that I have, because this is one that comes up repetitively from communities. It is actually around the language materials. And one of the things that we know with a lot of language materials is Indigenous communities don't actually own their language materials because of the documentation that's happened of those language materials. That means
Mm,
that they're either owned by a third party, or they're in a archival repository that they don't know where it is. And so I kind of wonder a little bit about where you saw uh, Microsoft getting its low resource language data from,
mhm,
and what kinds of permissions that it had, either from a known copyright holder, or the community itself in relationship to it. So what often happens is, if
mm,
communities aren't the copyright holders,
mhm.
then communities don't need, like, by law, are not required to provide permission for their language, for the use of their language materials. We know that that is part of kind of cultural discrimination that happens in copyright law. But I kind of wonder just how you saw that play out in real time.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question because the answer is there were so many different iterations for where the different data could come from. And what I found, so let's just use New Zealand as an example. Um, Maori was one of the languages that was pulled into this launch that Microsoft did. And I did work with a few different communities. So there was one data set that was from University of Auckland, I believe. That is, don't quote me on that, but they there was one data set there. I think that the data licensing agreement had expired or something, and so they had to go and reapproach. And then the university said, "Well, hang on, we have to actually go talk to the community again." Great response. I would say that that wasn't necessarily the norm. Another group that we worked with was the government of Nunavut in Canada, and with Inuktitut and Inuinnaqtun was previously done with machine learning and Microsoft and machine learning. AI is machine learning. machine learning, though, is considered like kind of the older or slimmer version of AI, and the LLM version is like the mega version of the same sort of thing. Um, so Microsoft had worked with the government of Nunavut, which is not the community that's not the indigenous community, and but they were the language holders, if you will, for Inuinnaqtun and Inuktitut. Uh, there was also a third party involved in that, which was this language board, and that was also true in another language situation in New Zealand for a different group, and is often the case. There's like some sort of language board or group that establishes like what are the official words that we're using, because new words have to be created all the time, um, because language is living, just like culture is. You have to have iPad thrown in there and iPhone and AI and anything else under the sun that comes up as a new word. Um, so the language board in one case was another entity that we had to go and work on data licensing with. For the Inuktitut component, that ultimately ended up being with the government of Nunavut, and they actually did like a tremendous amount of data collection independently. Honestly, one of the coolest efforts from a government I have ever seen. Whether or not you agree with what they ended up doing with Microsoft, they have created a set of data that is kind of unmatched for a low resource language. I wouldn't say that it's high resource now, but amazing the amount of data that they've been able to collect. So it was yeah, it was very interesting to see all over the place.
So, I mean, that also raises something that I think that maybe people here are also really interested in, like given the kind of safer framework that you kind of laid out for us, which I think is really, really helpful to kind of think through, is like, how could we see uh, AI be used for for benefit within community context? So obviously, communities need to control their data, they need to govern it, they need to hold it on their lands, they need to have sovereign servers, they need to have all of these kinds of pieces in place or be working towards that in some way or another. Control over the data is going to be key to anything that is kind of done in the future. But that with what if that step could be kind of supported in a different kind of way, then the possibility of doing work around aggregated data that's on tribal lands for biodiversity monitoring or climate change or connecting cultural
Mhm.
data with climate data has a real possibility of answering tribally developed questions about their data and what that could be. I just wondered if that's kind of something that you see as the way in which AI could be utilized to benefit communities.
Yes, I think that across the board, what we're going to find is that the most useful applications of AI are going to be these smaller models or RAG-based models. Uh, I think that in a tribal context, honestly, for those communities that have decided to just like completely opt out of cloud and keep all of their data on premises, you got an opportunity right now to have your own clean data sets, take and work with a company to set up an on-premises AI, and oh my goodness, like the things that you would be able to do are quite amazing. Just let's bring this just to like a customer service perspective. As you guys know, in tribal settings, you have a million jobs. The job that I did at Swinomish had so many components to it, I couldn't list them today, even if I tried, because there was just a crazy amount of things. Like I was the de facto fire chief and inspector for like if there was a fire on on the reservation. I had no background and training in that. I oversaw cemeteries. I had to like learn about vaults and purchasing them, and then it was like anything under the sun. Dental health therapist licensing, that was part of my department. You name it, we probably did some part of it. So I had to learn and do a number of jobs. That in itself is difficult. AI would have made that a lot easier. If I had our full set of tribal laws at my fingertips, case law at my fingertips, my ability to answer questions for tribal members or community members living on reservation, trying to navigate some process or another. Those are things that you could have these more discrete models set up, and have them be able to reference these specific data sets. um, then my ability to answer questions as a specific staff person is there. You can also set up like little agents. I mean, this is where things get complicated because there's like an online component to an agent, unless you've set up just a like community-based Wi-Fi system. That is possible. But you can set up like a little agent that could answer very specific questions. It's like the old style cities 411 calls, or Text My Gov, which is a more common one now. There's applications for all levels of government, but I think that the opportunity for tribes actually is huge because we've been collecting and maintaining these data sets, and just the environmental data alone. I mean, like your ability to track things, and then if you're able to go and push that against an LLM, or pull in another discrete data set, download it, and then run it against that. The ability to take and manipulate that data and actually understand far more than your average local government, state government, and definitely more than our federal government here in the US. But the capabilities there are huge. The other component of that that I'd say is really important, other side of that coin, is that if you are putting that data out there, we know that data is being used as surveillance and as is weaponized against people. So protecting it is imperative right now. Especially all of those, there's the environmental data, that's critical. The information about your people and about your culture cannot. I mean, I say that in a very firm way. I'm saying that it's important to protect it. And now more than ever, like there, here's your opportunity to take and make sure that you're protecting things for your future generations for time immemorial. Like we have the opportunity now to kind of make sure that it's safe.
So, Chinan, Sam, I am super grateful for you speaking with us here today. I do want to point out for those listening that you have dropped your LinkedIn into the chat. And I want to thank everybody for attending today. As a reminder, I've got a lot of reminders here. Please complete the survey for the webinar. We also encourage you to attend future webinars. Next week, we'll talk about the new IEEE 2890 recommended practice for the provenance of Indigenous peoples data standard that came out about a month or two ago. We will host a number of other webinars, which you can join by joining our mailing list, which I think will get dropped into the chat very soon. Um, and I would also like to encourage people to look at the summit that the Indigenous Data Alliance is hosting with the U.S. Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network in April here in Tucson or Tucson. And we hope to see you at all of those. So, Chinan, Neklatani, to Jane, and to Zam for talking with us today. And this has been a fantastic introduction to AI. And I really appreciated your framing, Zam. And I think your final comments kind of wrapped it up in terms of like, how do we operate within these fields of artificial intelligence today in a way that is aligned with, and I saw in some of the comments in the chat, the roles and responsibilities that we have within our communities and the way that we want to use our relationships and our knowledges and our languages to advance our own futures. Goodbye, everybody, and we will see you again soon.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining us. And thanks, Zam. That was a fantastic webinar for everyone.
Lots of LinkedIn's getting dropped in the chat. Thank you, everybody. Hey, waving Maui with my cam's off, but I'm waving at Maui. Also, shout out to our ASL interpreters from UA, holding it down. Okay, I'm gonna stop recording now.
Thanks, Andrew.